Every billionaire has a first dollar. Most people forget about it the moment the second million rolls in. This is a story about a man who never did. This is a story about Daniel Voss, the boy who slept in a laundromat, and the man who built an empire out of spite, hunger, and one unbearable promise he made to a woman who never got to see him keep it. This is not a story about luck. Luck is for people who stop trying. This is a story about the last dollar Daniel Voss ever had to fight for, and what it cost him to never have to fight again. Beat! Stick around, because the ending isn't what you think. And along the way, you're going to meet the people who almost broke him, a business partner who betrayed him at the worst possible moment, a mentor who taught him the one lesson money can't buy, and a daughter who, without ever trying to, saved him from himself. This is a full story. Let's begin. Narrator, Detroit, 1994. Daniel Voss was 11 years old, and he already understood something most adults spend a lifetime avoiding. The world does not care whether you eat. His mother, Rosa, worked 2 jobs, one folding laundry at a wash and fold on Grand River Avenue, the other cleaning offices after midnight downtown. His father was a name on a birth certificate and nothing else, a man named Carl who had left when Daniel was 4, and who Daniel would not think about again until he was well into his 30s, and even then, only for about 90 seconds. So when the heat got shut off in their apartment that January, Rosa did the only thing she could. She brought Daniel to work with her. He did his homework on a folding table between the dryers. He slept on a bench built for waiting customers, wrapped in a donated coat 2 sizes too big, a coat that smelled permanently of fabric softener no matter how many times it was washed. He remembers the sound most, the hum of 30 dryers running at once, like a heartbeat that never stopped. He used to tell himself that sound was the whole world breathing, and as long as he could hear it, they hadn't lost yet. Rosa Voss was not a woman who complained. She had a saying, one Daniel would repeat to boardroom 3 decades later without a hint of irony. Tired is not an excuse. Tired is a Tuesday. She believed, genuinely, unshakably, that hard work was a door, and if you knocked on it long enough, it opened. She was wrong about a lot of things. She was wrong about that laundromat owner, a man named Hector Delgado, who underpaid her for 6 years and once docked her pay for a shift she missed to take Daniel to the emergency room with a broken wrist. She was wrong about the landlord who raised their rent the same month she got sick. But she was never wrong about Daniel. She looked at her son, folding towels at midnight with his shoes falling apart at the seams, and she told him something he never forgot. Rosa, V.O., warm but firm, you're going to have money someday. Daniel. Not because you're lucky, because you're going to refuse to lose. There's a difference. Luck runs out. Refusing doesn't. There's a memory Daniel still carries from that winter. One has only told 2 people in his entire life. It was February, and the laundromat had a small television bolted to the wall in the corner, tuned permanently to whatever channel came in clearest. One night, a business news segment came on, showing footage of a stock exchange floor, men in colored jackets shouting, papers flying, a ticker running along the bottom of the screen. 11-year-old Daniel watched it for 11 straight minutes without blinking. Daniel, V.O., young, quiet mama, what are they doing? Rosa, V.O. making money move, baby. Some people spend their whole lives learning how to do that. Daniel, V.O., can I learn? Rosa, V.O., a small laugh, you're already learning. You just don't know it yet. She died 2 years later. Not dramatically. No hospital monologue. No last word scripted for a movie. She collapsed to the office building she cleaned, alone, at 2 a.m. from an aneurysm nobody saw coming. A security guard doing his rounds found her the next morning, still holding her mop. Daniel was 13. He went to live with his Aunt Denise, a kind but overwhelmed woman with 3 kids of her own in a 2-bedroom apartment in Southfield. There wasn't room for grief in that apartment. Not really. There was room for chores, for shared beds, for a boy who stopped talking much for the better part of a year. Denise noticed. She didn't push. She just kept a plate warm for him every night, whether he came to the table or not. He got a job at 14, lying about his age, bagging groceries at a store called Farmer Jack's. At 16, he was working 2 jobs, same as his mother had, the grocery store and, after school, a repair counter at a strip mall electronics shop, sweeping floors and watching closely everything the technician did. At 17, He discovered something that would change the entire shape of his life: a broken computer at a pawn shop, marked down to $9 because the screen flickered. He bought it with money he'd been saving in a coffee can under his bed. He fixed it using a manual he photocopied at the public library, page by page, because he couldn't afford to buy it. And he sold it for $60 to a kid 2 blocks over who wanted it for video games. That was the first time Daniel Voss understood a truth that would make him one of the richest men alive. Value isn't what something costs. Value is what someone else can't fix, doesn't have time to fix, or doesn't know is broken in the first place. He was 17, and he had already found a crack in the world that he would spend the rest of his life prying opened up. by 19, Daniel wasn't fixing one computer at a time. He was buying broken electronics in bulk from liquidation warehouses, repairing them in his aunt's garage, much to the mild irritation of his cousins, who could no longer park their bikes in there, and reselling them online, back when online still felt like a rumor to most people his age. He dropped out of community college after 2 semesters, not because he failed, but because he did the math. Tuition was $4,000 a semester. His side business was already clearing $3,000 a month. His academic advisor, a well-meaning man named Professor Whitfield, tried to talk him out of it. Professor Whitfield, VO, a degree is leverage. Daniel, it's a door that stays open even when the market closes on you. Daniel, VO, with respect, sir, I've never once seen a locked door stop somebody hungry enough. I've seen it stop somebody comfortable enough to wait for the key. Narrator, he didn't see dropping out as a risk. He saw it as arithmetic. It's a philosophy that would define him for the next 20 years, and one that would occasionally cost him more than he was willing to admit. By 23, he had incorporated the business as Voss Electronics Recovery. By 26, he had 12 employees in a warehouse in Warren, Michigan, and a business partner, a sharp, fast-talking man named Marcus Reyes, who Daniel had met at a liquidation auction and who could talk a room into anything. Marcus handled sales and relationships. Daniel handled everything else. For a few years, it was the best partnership Daniel had ever had with anyone outside his family. By 30, Voss Electronics Recovery had become one of the largest independent electronics refurbishing operations in the Midwest, buying broken inventory from insurance write-offs and retail returns, and turning it into a $100 million revenue stream. This is usually where the story would end in most people's telling. Poor kid makes good. Roll credits. But Daniel Voss was not most people. And this is where the story actually gets complicated. Every empire has a chapter its founder doesn't like to talk about. For Daniel Voss, that chapter is named Marcus Reyes. By 31, the company, now rebranded Voltex, was preparing for its first major outside investment round, a deal that would value the company at close to $400 million. Marcus, as co-founder, held 22%. It should have been the best week of both their lives. Instead, 3 days before the deal was set to close, Daniel discovered that Marcus had been quietly negotiating a side agreement with the lead investor, one that would have diluted Daniel control of the company he'd built from a garage, in exchange for Marcus being installed as CEO. Marcus had convinced the investor that Daniel, blunt and unpolished in board meetings, wasn't investor-facing enough to lead a company at this scale. Marcus, smooth and charismatic, was, Daniel found out by accident, a forwarded email that wasn't meant to reach him, sent by an assistant who didn't realize what she was forwarding. He remembers sitting in his car in the parking garage for 40 minutes after reading it, not moving, not calling anyone. Then he remembers walking back into the office and doing something that surprised the entire leadership team. He didn't yell. He didn't fire Marcus on the spot. He asked for one thing. Daniel, VO, cold, controlled, give me the room. Marcus, just the two of us. Narrator, what was said in that room has never been publicly confirmed by either man. But what happened next is a matter of record. Daniel restructured the deal himself in 4 sleepless days, personally flying to meet the investor and renegotiating terms that kept him in control of the company at the cost of a slightly lower valuation than they'd originally been offered. Marcus was bought out of his shares over the following 18 months, at a fair price, but was never offered another role at the company. They have not spoken since. 15 years later, when a journalist asked Daniel about Marcus Reyes during a profile interview, Daniel gave an answer that made the final cut of the piece word for word. Daniel, VO, even, no bitterness left in it. He taught me something my mother never got the chance to. Talent gets you in the room. Character decides whether you get to stay in it. I don't hate him. I just stopped inviting him. This betrayal changed Daniel in a way that took years to fully surface. He became harder to read. He stopped bringing on equal partners. Every hire from that point forward, no matter how senior, worked for Voltex, not beside it in the way Marcus once had. It made him a more effective operator. It also made him, for the better part of a decade, a much lonelier one. Success didn't soften him. If anything, it sharpened something that had always been there, a refusal to ever again be the kid on the bench in the laundromat. And now, a refusal to ever again be the man blindsided in the boardroom. He worked 90-hour weeks. He fired people who showed up late, even by 5 minutes, because lateness, to him, wasn't a scheduling issue. It was a signal that someone didn't understand what it meant to lose everything. He married once, at 32, to a woman named Elena Marsh, a supply chain attorney he met during an acquisition negotiation, one of the few people in that period of his life who challenged him instead of flattering him, which is precisely why he fell for her. She was sharp, funny, unimpressed by money in a way that fascinated him, because everyone else in his life had started being impressed by money the moment he had any. They had a daughter, Mia, when Daniel was 35. And this is a part of the story where most billionaire narratives skip ahead to the yacht, the private jet, the headline-grabbing acquisition. We're not going to do that, because the next several years of Daniel Voss's life are the ones that actually explain the man he became, and they have almost nothing to do with money at all. Elena noticed at first the way Daniel would take calls during Mia's school recitals, the way one more year became a permanent sentence in his vocabulary. One more year until he'd slow down. One more year until the company didn't need him at the center of every decision. One more year. She wasn't wrong to notice, but she also wasn't entirely right about why it was happening. Daniel wasn't chasing money anymore. By 36, Voltex was valued north of $2 billion. He didn't need another dollar. What he was chasing was quieter and far more dangerous. The feeling that if he ever stopped moving, the 11-year-old on the laundromat bench would catch up to him. And underneath that, something even harder to say out loud, the fear that if he ever fully trusted anyone with the company again, the way he trusted Marcus, he'd get burned the same way twice. Elena, VO, gentle, tired, you're not running toward anything anymore, Daniel. You're running from a kid who doesn't exist anymore. And you're going to miss the actual kid, the one down the hall, while you do it. He heard her. He didn't listen. There's a difference, and it's one Daniel Voss would spend years learning the hard way. There's a specific memory from this period that Elena has spoken about publicly once in a podcast interview years later, not to embarrass Daniel, but because she said it was a moment she understood the marriage was in trouble. Mia was 5. She had a piano recital, her first one, 3 songs she'd practiced for 2 months. Daniel had promised he'd be there. He was in Singapore closing a supply agreement when the flight home got delayed by a mechanical issue. He missed it by 40 minutes. He came straight from the airport, still in his suit, and sat in the back of an empty auditorium because the recital was already over and the janitor was stacking chairs. He sat there for 20 minutes anyway. Elena, VO, on the podcast. Years later, I wasn't angry that he missed it. Things happen. I was scared because of what he said when he got home. He said, I'll make it up to her. And I remember thinking, you can't make up a Tuesday, Daniel. There's no version of Saturday that gives her back that Tuesday. Narrator, Elena and Daniel separated when Mia was 6. Not because of infidelity, not because of some dramatic betrayal, but because of the much more common, much less cinematic reason marriages actually end. 2 people who used to run toward each other slowly started running in different directions, and neither of them turned around in time. The divorce was, by billionaire standards, almost boring. No scandal. No tabloid war. Elena didn't want to fight. She wanted her daughter to have a stable life, and she got it, along with a settlement that made headlines mostly because of how reasonable it was. Daniel signed everything without negotiating a single clause. His board of directors thought he'd lost his mind. His lawyer, a veteran named Saul Applebaum who'd handled 3 other billionaire divorces, told him flatly he was leaving 9 figures on the table out of guilt. Daniel, VO, flat, certain, I know exactly what 9 figures is worth. It's worth less than my daughter not hating me by the time she's 20. This is a moment in Daniel Voss's life that never made it into a magazine profile, because it doesn't fit the art magazines want to sell. There was no triumphant comeback scene. There was a 40-year-old man, sitting alone in a house too large for one person, staring at a phone that used to ring every night at 7 p.m. for a bedtime story he now only got to do 3 nights a week. He thought about his mother. He thought about the bench in the laundromat. He thought, for the first time in years, about Marcus Reyes, not with anger, but with a strange, unwelcome recognition. Had he become someone who protected everything except the things that actually mattered? For the first time since he was 13 years old, Daniel Voss allowed himself to ask a question he'd spent 2 decades outrunning. What was all of this actually for? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. So he did what he always did when he didn't have an answer. He threw himself back into work, and for 18 more months, nothing changed. Voltex grew. Daniel got richer, and the distance between him and everyone who loved him grew right along with it. The turning point didn't come from a business failure, a health scare, or a dramatic confrontation. It came from an old man named Walter Okafor, who Daniel met almost by accident. Walter had built and sold 2 companies of his own decades earlier, and now spent his retirement doing something Daniel found bizarre at first, mentoring young founders for free, 1 afternoon a week, at a community center in Ann Arbor. A mutual contact introduced them after a conference, mostly as a courtesy meeting. Daniel expected to spend 30 minutes being flattered. Instead, Walter spent the first 10 minutes asking him almost nothing about Voltex at all. Walter, V.O., gravelly, unhurried, how old's your daughter now? Daniel, V.O., caught off guard 6. Why? Walter, V.O., because you've talked for 10 minutes about revenue and margin and not once mentioned her unprompted. I've met 100 men like you. Son, I was a man like you. Let me guess, you think you're building this empire for her. Daniel, V.O., defensive, I am building it for her. Walter, V.O., no. You're building it so that if she ever ends up on a bench in a laundromat, it won't be your fault. That's not the same thing as building it for her. One of those is love. The other is an argument with a ghost. And son, you cannot win an argument with a ghost. You can only put it down. Daniel didn't say anything for a long time after that. Walter let the silence sit, which was, Daniel would later say, the single most useful thing anyone had done for him in 15 years. Nobody had let him sit in silence since his mother died. Everyone else filled it with advice, with flattery, with asks. He started meeting Walter every other week. Not about business. Walter refused, almost stubbornly, to discuss Voltex's operations in any detail. Their conversation circled the same handful of questions, over and over, from different angles. What are you actually afraid of? When did you last do something with no professional purpose at all? What would your mother think of the way you spend your Tuesdays? That last question undid him the first time Walter asked it. Daniel didn't answer for 2 full weeks. When he finally did, at their next meeting, it wasn't really an answer, it was a story. The first time he'd told anyone outside his family about the laundromat, about the bench, about the hum of 30 dryers that sounded like the whole world breathing. Walter listened to the entire thing without interrupting once. When Daniel finished, Walter said only this, Your mother didn't want you to build a fortress, Daniel. She wanted you to stop being cold. Those aren't the same project. You spent 30 years on the wrong one. Here's where a lesser story would have Daniel Voss quit everything, moved to a cabin, and discover the true meaning of wealth in a way that feels engineered for a highlight reel. Real life is messier than that, and so is this story. Daniel didn't quit Voltex. He restructured it. He hired a president to run day-to-day operations, a woman named Priya Nandakamo, who he'd fought to keep for 8 years and had never fully trusted with the reins, because trusting someone else with the thing that saved his life had never come naturally to him, not since Marcus. It took him 3 attempts to actually let go. The first time, he was back in the office within 11 days, citing a supply chain emergency that Priya later admitted, with a laugh, hadn't actually been an emergency at all. The second time lasted 6 weeks. The third time, he made it 4 months before he came back, not because the company needed him, but because he'd finally found something to come back for, instead of something to run from. He started showing up to mere soccer games. Not the important ones, all of them. He learned, slowly and clumsily, that presence isn't a grand gesture. It's 1,000 small, boring Tuesdays where you choose to be in the room instead of on the phone. He missed the first 2 games trying to just quickly finish an email from the sideline. Mia noticed, in the quiet, unforgiving way that children notice everything done to me, V.O., young, matter of fact, you're here, but your face isn't. He put the phone in the car after that. Every game. He also did something that surprised absolutely everyone who thought they understood Daniel Voss. He went back to Detroit. Not for a press event. Not for a tax write-off ribbon cutting with his name on a building. He went back quietly on a Saturday and found the Laundromat on Grand River Avenue, the one where he'd done his homework between the dryers 30 years earlier. It was still there. Different owner. Same hum of 30 dryers running at once. He stood outside for 11 minutes before he went in. The current owner, a woman named Fatima who'd bought the place 6 years earlier and had no idea who the tall man in the plain jacket was, watched him look around the room like he was reading a letter written a long time ago. Daniel, V.O., quiet, I used to sleep on a bench in here. Fatima, V.O., this bench. Daniel, V.O., that bench. He didn't buy the laundromat. He didn't turn it into a monument to himself, which is what almost everyone in his position would have done. Instead, he did something much stranger and much more Daniel Voss. He quietly funded a scholarship, not in his own name, but in his mother's. The Rosa Voss Fund, for kids in Detroit whose parents worked night shifts covering childcare so that no 11-year-old in the city would ever have to do their homework on a folding table between industrial dryers because there was nowhere else for them to be. He gave the fund $100 million and never once mentioned it publicly. A local reporter found out 2 years later, entirely by accident, while covering a different story about a community center it had helped build. When she called Voltex for comment, Daniel's response, his entire response, was 4 words. Daniel, V.O., she would have liked that. He also did one more thing that year, something even Walter didn't know about until much later. He wrote a letter to Marcus Reyes. Not an apology. Daniel never believed he owed one, but not an attack either. 3 paragraphs, handwritten, thanking Marcus in a strange and roundabout way for teaching him a lesson that ended up shaping the second half of his life more than any success ever had. Marcus never wrote back. Daniel never expected him to. He said, later, that the letter was never really for Marcus at all. It was for the version of himself who'd sat in that parking garage for 40 minutes, deciding what kind of man he was going to become in the aftermath. And so what do we actually make of Daniel Voss? It would be easy, lazy, even, to tell you this story ends with him finding perfect peace. It doesn't. He still works too much some weeks. He and Elena are civil, sometimes warm, never quite what they were, and has made peace with the fact that some doors, once closed, don't reopen no matter how much money you have. He still thinks about Marcus more often than he'd like to admit, usually in board meetings, usually when a new hire says something a little too smooth, a little too convincing. But Mia, now 16, has a photo on her nightstand of her and her dad at a Detroit soccer field, both of them soaked from a sudden rainstorm, both of them laughing so hard neither can stand up straight. It's not a professional photo. It's blurry. Actually, Elena took it on her phone and sent it to him, unprompted, months after the divorce. The first sign, he says now, that things between them might eventually be okay. Daniel keeps a copy in his office, not the framed photos of skyline ribbon cuttings, not the magazine covers, not the photo with 3 different presidents. Just that one. Crooked, wet, real. Here's the part of the story I promised you at the beginning. The part that isn't what you think. The lesson of Daniel Voss's life was never work hard enough and you'll become a billionaire. Plenty of people work that hard and never see a fraction of what he built, because building an empire takes more than effort. It takes timing, luck, partners who don't betray you, mentors who find you at the right moment, and 100 variables no one fully controls. Pretending otherwise is a disservice to every person out there working 2 jobs right now, exhausted, doing everything right, and still not seeing the door open. The real lesson, the one Daniel Voss would tell you himself, if you sat across from him and asked, is this, Daniel V.O. final, steady money didn't save me. It just gave me the option to stop running long enough to ask what I actually wanted. Most people never get that option. I got lucky, and then I worked, and then, eventually, an old man in a community center made me sit still long enough to get honest with myself. The money was never the finish line. It was just the thing that finally let me put the race down. I just wish I'd put it down about 10 years sooner. Daniel Voss is 51 years old now. Voltex is worth $11 billion. He could retire tomorrow and never think about a spreadsheet again. He doesn't. He still goes to the office 3 days a week. Not because he has to, but because Priya says he's actually pretty good at the job when he's not trying to prove something with it. Walter Okafor passed away 2 years ago, at 86. Daniel gave the eulogy. He said the same thing at the funeral that he says now, whenever someone asks him about the secret to his success, and it's never once been about money. Daniel Voss, he taught me that the things that break you and the things that save you are usually the same size. It just depends what you do with them. And every year, on the anniversary of his mother's death, Daniel does the same thing. He drives to the Laundromat on Grand River Avenue. He buys a coffee from the gas station next door, and he sits on the bench, the same one, for exactly as long as it takes to drink it. Then he gets up, and he goes back to being the man his mother always said he'd become. Not lucky, not perfect, just someone who refused to lose, and who, eventually, learned the difference between refusing to lose and knowing when he'd already won. That's the story of Daniel Voss. If it made you think about your own first dollar, the one you fought hardest for, let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. Because everyone's got a laundromat bench somewhere in their past. The only question is what you build after you finally stand up from it.